Hello and welcome to TEDCast, the show that explores the topics that are on team leaders' minds. Today's topic is around planning for the year ahead with TED and covers some of the topics that were discussed in our recent workshop with team leaders at Lancashire Teaching Hospitals. My name's Lee Hart-Hunt and I'm the TED lead for Lancashire Teaching Hospitals. I hope you enjoy the show and please give us your feedback in the comments. So in this workshop, we were focusing on planning for the year ahead using TED. So over the course of this workshop, together with colleagues from across Lancashire Teaching Hospitals, we looked at the challenges to planning in a busy work environment, the value of the planning process, and how to make smart plans together with your team. With this, we intertwined TED to show how you can use TED as part of that planning process to make it easier, more inclusive, and more representative of what your team hopes to achieve. The first thing we looked at in the workshop was to explore what types of plans you have as teams out there working in very diverse work environments. On the call, we had members of clinical and non-clinical teams. We had large teams and small teams, teams with really diverse work portfolios. So we had a range of different ways that those teams were going about planning. It was clear that planning was something which is quite unique for every team, and it depends on the specific work that they do, the different people that are in their team, and the needs of different stakeholders that they work with. But we can see from this slide that there are different types of plans in terms of short-term plans, like maybe daily routines or weekly checklists that teams have. Sometimes there are medium-term plans where teams might have a monthly priority, or they might have upcoming events that they're working towards. And some teams also have long-term plans like project milestones, or maybe long-term visions for where they're headed as a team. It was encouraging to see that many teams had all three of these different types of plans, and at different points they will zoom in and zoom out of their different plans to check that they're on the right direction and ensure that the work that they're doing today is in line with where they're headed together as a team. This is what we want to encourage with TED, but it's important to recognise just what a challenge it is for many teams when they're often in really busy work environments, and planning or getting time for planning can be a challenge. So the next thing we looked at together is what makes it difficult to plan for teams. So we had a great discussion with input from lots of different diverse team leaders in different types of team settings. And the main things that came out of this conversation were that uncertainty is a really big barrier for planning. Teams often find it difficult to plan, and they don't know when the demand for their work will be from one week to the next. Another factor which influenced them was external factors, which are often outside of the team's control. And these might include things like wider NHS initiatives, might be the needs of the community, it might be changing government guidance, things that the team themselves can't influence. It might lead to some of that uncertainty because they don't know what future changes might be. So it makes it really difficult for definitely that medium to long-term planning in different team contexts. The next big challenge, and one that most of the teams on the call identified as a big challenge for them when planning, was time constraints. Many teams indicated that their biggest challenge for planning is that they don't have time to create that space for planning. The feeling of firefighting means that there's always a more pressing priority which distracts them from future thinking or limits their time to be future focused. Another challenge was in unforeseen circumstances. So colleagues mentioned that things such as unplanned sickness absences or equipment malfunction was often a challenge and can often derail plans or not confident in a team's progress towards a plan, which might make it challenging when making plans again in the future. And the final one which came up was in conflicting views. So we saw that often planning can be a challenge when there are different viewpoints from different members of a team, maybe from external factors as well, on which direction a team should be heading, and it can be hard to decide on what's the next best step forward when you can't reach a consensus over what those next steps should be. I shared this slide, this quote, which I think is quite a useful one in highlighting the importance of planning above the value of plans themselves. I disagree slightly that plans are useless, but really a plan is just a way of communicating where you're heading, either to your own team or to different stakeholders that can get value from understanding what your team is about and where you're heading. The real value in the planning process comes from being able to create space to think, be able to share ideas, understand opportunities, and set direction. Planning itself gives you an opportunity to reflect on how far you've come, but also helps you to make sure that you're headed in the right direction. In the group, we looked at some of the factors which make planning so useful, and things like this came up. So it was that opportunity to check your direction. Maybe you've made a plan in the past and you can use your current planning work to check in to see if you're on the right direction, so you can recognize that progress that your team has made. It's an opportunity to celebrate as well. The next factor that came up was that it gave you this opportunity to adapt. So if you're not heading in the right direction, or something has changed and your end goal has shifted due to those external factors maybe, then the planning process gives you this opportunity to adapt and maybe tweak your course of action so that you can get back on track with where you want to be headed. This also means you might want to refocus your priorities. So what was a pressing priority when you last went through planning? Maybe this time last year you made a big plan for the year, but this year those things that were a priority perhaps aren't such a big deal at the moment, and there's maybe something else which is more pressing, more important, or would add more value to the work that you're doing together in your team. We also talked about planning being an opportunity for shared learning. So planning is best when it's not done in isolation. By including your team together in that planning process, it helps create that shared commitment to your plans, and it also helps you to learn together to be able to reflect on how far you've come, but also learn around what has worked, what hasn't worked, and what might be the best things for the future. So it all helps to build this resilience, and something that I saw with a lot of teams who, when working through the pandemic and reflecting on challenges that they'd faced in the past, this process of planning, being able to look back before looking forward, helped them to realize that they'd come through some big challenges already, and that made them more resilient when thinking about future uncertainty or future challenges that they may face together. So when planning with your team, it's important to start by reflecting on your current context and the journey that you've been on to get there. Asking questions can help to engage the team and create a sense of shared agreement on your strengths, challenges, opportunities, and risks as you move forward. The challenge with team planning is that there can often be several different voices and opinions, all looking at the same situation through a different lens. So this is where we see TED providing that safe way to collate those different views across your team. Because TED gives you an anonymous approach to gathering that feedback, it means that all team members can be honest and give their personal perspective and views, which will add to that broader picture which you get in your TED report. TED gives you a balanced view because it aggregates and it gives everybody's opinion equal weighting across your results. The report helps you to see your strengths and areas for improvement at a glance, and it's a repeatable process. So each time you repeat the TED process, you can measure your progress. You can see how far you've come. You can see what might have improved and use that as an opportunity to celebrate, but you can also see what might have declined and use it for a topic of conversation so that you can explore what may have challenged you, what you might want to work for on your next TED cycle. If this is your first TED, you might be considering using it as that baseline. And TED is a great fixed benchmark to be able to track your progress against, which you can regularly repeat at times which are most important and will have the most value for your team. TED helps to cut out the noise so that you can focus on the most important factors with evidence to justify your approach. So those factors which the TED report highlights as key priorities, or that your TED conversation explores together, those can be the ones that you focus on and your way forward with your team. The next thing that we looked at together, it was the circle of influence exercise. This is actually one of our TED Toolkit resources and one that I often recommend to teams. If you have a team with those really diverse opinions, and perhaps you can sometimes get stuck on factors which sit outside of your control, and it can be frustrating that might hamper your planning process, because those are often things which you can't affect yourself. When you're looking at this sort of sphere of influence, you would think about the factors which maybe come up in your TED discussion or on your TED report, and you think about which of those factors sit inside your central sphere of control. Those should be the things that you focus on, because those are the things that are within your power and within your team's power to be able to influence. There might be things slightly outside your sphere of control which you can influence. So that might involve talking with other teams, raising awareness of what your team does, or liaising with external stakeholders. But the things that sit outside of your control in the wider environment, those are things which is important to acknowledge, because those are things that do affect the team. But it's important to be able to move past them. And the spheres of influence, the circle of influence exercise, helps you to do that as part of a team workshop. Next, we looked at SMART objectives. I'm sure you'll have heard this acronym before, but it really does set out a great way for being able to make sure the actions that come out of something like TED can be things which will have the most impact, and where you can check your progress over time. When using SMART objectives with your team, it's important to be specific in your action planning. So you might want to consider with the team, what do you want to achieve? You might explore these sorts of questions in your TED conversation. Think about what a good outcome might look like. Look to specify which team members are involved, and the best TED plans are always ones which involve every single member of the team. So there's that personal accountability, that opportunity to take personal responsibility for everything that your team's trying to achieve. Next, it's important to specify when you're going to take action. So if something is time specific, set time aside to be able to do that. Or if it's something that's ongoing, make sure that that's clear and that all the team understands that that's something which applies to your everyday work. And finally, you might want to specify why it's important to your team. Getting that clear why, maybe include reflecting on your TED feedback, maybe coming back to team purpose exercises or the toolkits within TED around team purpose can help you identify the why for your team. So that might be, why does your team exist? What are you looking to achieve? And how does it fit in with your broader context? Next element of our SMART acronym is about making our plans measurable. So you might want to discuss with your team, how are you going to measure progress? Are the numbers involved in what you're trying to achieve? Will you need to get feedback from colleagues or other stakeholders? And will you repeat the TED survey or use staff survey as a way of measuring if it's impacted on your team dynamics? You might also want to think about, what are the key milestones? So when are you going to check in? Don't leave it a year till you check in. As an organisation, we encourage every team to do TED at least once per year, but that doesn't mean that you forget about it for a year. It means you should think around, what are those milestones in between? And you might use TED in conjunction with something like staff survey that's at a fixed point in the year, and plan your TEDs at interim points to have those more regular measures throughout the year. But think about what's right for you and your team. Finally, you want to think about how you're going to check in on your progress. So is that going to be during a team brief, maybe an audit day, or having a quarterly review? Maybe it's something that you do weekly and you build it into your regular team briefs or team meetings. Think about what's right and appropriate for your plans. The achievable element in our SMART acronym sets out how it's important to consider what are realistic expectations. If you're too unrealistic or too overly ambitious, this can be a demotivator for your team if you don't seem to be making progress to your plans. But also think around, are your plans challenging enough? They need to be exciting, they need to be motivating, they need to have some element of challenge, but still feel achievable for team members. If this isn't the first time that you've started planning, reflect on previous plans. Think about what's worked, perhaps what's not worked in the past. If you have been overly ambitious in the past, reflect on that. Think around how you can take into account some of those things which might be unforeseen. And maybe you've got a gold, silver and bronze standard of success and you can measure yourselves in that way. So think about, again, what's right and relevant for your team. So when we look at that factor of being relevant, it's important to consider how your plans support that team purpose. I mentioned earlier about thinking about your team purpose, and if you're unsure where to start with TED feedback, I'd always recommend getting that team purpose right first, because everything else will align towards what your core purpose is as a team. Also think about that broader context. Do your plans align with our organizational values and plans? Maybe think about your divisional action plan or our big plan as an organization, and think around what elements of your own team's plan link with those broader objectives. Also think around the different stakeholders that interact with your team. How do your plans align with them? Is it important to communicate your plans to them? So these stakeholders might include other teams that you work with. It might include patients and families. It might include stakeholders outside of the organization. Think around who it is that you work with and where the value those teams or individuals would get from understanding your plans, and what value you'd get from understanding their plans and how they intertwine. And the last point in our SMART acronym is around being time bound. It's so important that you have a time frame in mind when you set your plans. So think around, when do you expect to achieve your goals? Now, this might be difficult on things around team engagement, maybe, because it might be something which there's never a clear milestone, but there'll definitely be points where you can say, this is when we want to achieve maybe a certain TED score, or when staff survey is in the year, and this is when you want to achieve a certain score on that. So think around what are those measures and when a reasonable time frame would be for you to achieve those. Think around how you're going to hold each other accountable. So those might be thinking about those milestones or what's going to happen along the journey towards those milestones. And then also think around what that final review might look like. For many, it would be a case of repeating TED. Use the follow-up TED process, because that gives you a great measure for how far you've come. It helps you identify where you've got opportunity to celebrate those successes, and also to reflect on areas which maybe didn't come along as much as you would have liked. So the final section of our workshop looked at action planning. So action plans are a great way to be able to summarize what you've talked about in your TED discussion, summarize what's come up in your TED report, and really use it as a clear way forward for your team. Really, your action plan brings everything together that's come out of the TED process and sets the direction for your next period of work together as a team. Tips to remember are to, firstly, remember to reflect on the positive areas that you can build on. It's not just about addressing areas which might be weaker than others. Think about being realistic. Think about that SMART acronym and make sure you're abiding by those different factors that are in there. But think around what are priorities. If you are one of those teams that's really stretched and might struggle to have 5, 6, 7 priorities, maybe just choose 1, 2, or 3 things. Think around what are the big things that we want to achieve between now and when we next revisit TED. If you're a team that's maybe going through winter pressures and is really stretched at the moment, you might just set yourself a number 1 priority, but then commit to revisiting TED in the summer and setting more broader priorities when you've got that time and space to be able to work on it. But think around what are the specifics of your team that would help you. So in the session, I shared this example of an action plan. This is one from a team at Lancashire Teaching Hospitals who created their own action plan on the back of TED. We can see in here there are different elements to this plan. Firstly, they've got broad actions for the team, but then what they've done really well here is they've broken that down to outline what are the individual responsibilities for each member of the team. And they've backed that up with that why question to summarize why they're doing this together as a team, what's influenced that action and why you're doing it. And the value of this is that as a team leader, it gives you a great plan which you can fall back on, which you can remind team members of if standards slip, and you can make sure it's something that you can measure as you go forward. The example on this slide shows that this team, who were working on team communication at the time, decided they wanted to hold more regular team huddles. So for individuals, what this meant was that there was that personal responsibility for individuals to attend huddles whenever possible, but also to take that personal responsibility to catch up if they did miss a team brief. In terms of why they were doing it, the team has outlined how their TED conversation, through their TED report, this was identified as a priority for them. So it really backs up and gives strength to that action, and it helps everybody get on the same page because they've all been involved in that discussion process. So in this workshop, I've highlighted some of the different TED toolkits which you can use, and I'll share the TED website now to show you how you can go about finding the Circle of Influence tool, or action plans, or even a visioning exercise which will help you with your team purpose. So when you're looking at the TED website, the easiest way to find a specific toolkit is to go up to the TED toolkit menu item at the top. When you get here, you can see that you've got a big list of all the different resources that sit within the TED website, but we've got over 107 different things, so it can take a while to find the things which you want. But if you know exactly what you're looking for, you might want to type in circle, and as you start typing it, it comes up there, and we can see our Circle of Influence toolkit ready to download and use with your team. Another useful one when action planning, if you just type in plan, you can see that we've got several different action plans, including some examples from teams who've done action plans in the past. Have a look at those, get a feel for what's right for your team. As we discussed at the start of this session, different teams plan in different ways. So find the action plan that is right for you. And you don't have to use these templates. Maybe get one and adapt it to suit your team's needs, or maybe adapt one of your existing plans to incorporate some of the TED themes. And the final one was that team visioning exercise. So with that visioning exercise, you can see we've got a few on this topic. But when we look at this, this is a team-based workshop. So if you're unsure about that why, or there are differences, opinions over why you exist as a team, where you're heading together, you can use this exercise to structure that discussion and work towards that clear purpose that your team might have. So the TED toolkits provide lots of useful ways for you to work on this with your team. So I'd advise you to look through this. If you're unsure where to start, use the themes down the left-hand side and choose an area which is most relevant to your team. Use your TED report to help set that direction, because that gives you the structure and it gives you the evidence to justify your way forward as a team. Coming back to our slides, we wrapped up the session by highlighting the different support that's available for you at Lancashire Teaching Hospitals. If you need any help or support with the website, you can get in touch with us at tedsupport@lthtr.nhs.uk. We can also help you through coaching support, and we've got our excellent MS Teams community where you can ask questions, you can see resources that we're developing, and you can get involved with future community events. Watch out for our future community catch-ups. And in the coming months, we'll be delivering some in-person events at Preston Hospital and Chorley Hospital, covering how to approach difficult feedback. If you'd like to review some of our previous TEDcasts and workshop events, they're on our YouTube channel. You can find them in our TED community. Our most recent one was about using TED when time is tight.